So we're on chapter 19 in the first section, and we were talking about industrial revolution and this happening in the world at that time. We're talking about the 1700 to 1800s, and we got down to the transportation. One of the first methods of transportation during this era was canals. And so they would build these canals and dig them to make transportation faster. Instead of going over land, there's a lot of trees and mountains and rocks, and the roads weren't very good. So they thought, let's build some canals. And so they dug these in various countries of Western Europe, but it became most popular in America, where hundreds of miles of canals were dug in the 18th and 19th century. If you look to the Erie Canal, and you go there even today and see that canal, it was built in 1825, it connected Lake Erie to the Hudson River. And then when we think of the world, we think of the Suez Canal in 1869. And this joined the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean by way of the Red Sea. So you wouldn't have to go all the way around, Africa. So a lot of canals were built in this time. Better transportation also meant better ships. So the best ships were the clipper ships. They were long, lean sailing vessels known for tremendous speeds on the high seas. And then came in steam, and we have the steamships. The new steamships surpassed them much because they didn't have to depend on the weather, did they? Robert Fulton, you need to know that name, Robert Fulton built the first practical steamship called the Clermont, which sailed 150 miles up the Hudson River in 1807 in America. So here we have now steamships, propelled by ships. There's a picture there of Robert Fulton there in his advertisement of the steamboat. Soon large ocean-going vessels were propelled by steam all over the place. And also they could add iron and steel hulls now, which advanced shipbuilding. Better transportation. Well, one of the biggest ways of transportation back then that was invented, one of the newest and the fastest type of transportation at the time was the rail system, the railroads. In 1814, George Stephenson, an English inventor, built the first practical steam-powered locomotive. So here we have a locomotive that's propelled by steam. Soon, railroad tracks were laid all over, and they provide cheaper and faster transportation over large areas of land. In 1870, there were major rail systems in Europe and the United States, and also even in Asia, Africa, and South America. Of course, we have the automobile. Look at these automobiles. They kind of look like bicycles that have been revamped or something, but those were the first automobiles. In 1886, Gottlieb Daimler, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but I think it's Daimler, perfected a gasoline fuel with a combustion engine. So here we have the first type of engine. We don't have the cars yet, but we have a gasoline fueled engine. 6 years later, Rudolf Diesel, another German, unveiled the diesel engine. So powerful enough for larger vehicles such as ships and trains. So now we have the diesel engine. And then we have some inventors such as Carl Benz. Have you ever heard of Mercedes-Benz? Well, it's named after Carl Benz and his family in Germany. And Henry Ford. Have you ever heard of Ford? Ford trucks, Ford cars? Yes, Henry Ford. And they lived about the same time there. And one in Germany and one in the United States. And they developed the first modern automobiles. Both used internal combustion engines to power. They called them the horseless carriages. They didn't need horses anymore to pull the carriages. They would have these engines, whether they'd be the gasoline fueled engine or the diesel fuel engine. They would use these engines to propel these horseless carriages. And later they founded companies to build automobiles. And we'll have the Ford Motor Company that was actually started by Henry Ford. And in Germany too, we have Mercedes-Benz. In 1840, England introduced what was called the penny post. And this made mail less expensive. They only had to pay a penny for their letters, right? And this so improved communications. But in 1844, Samuel Morse perfected what was called the electric telegraph. And it transmitted a code, Morse code, with dots and dashes over the electric wires. In 1866, Cyrus Field then laid the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable. So that was the first. Although Samuel Morse, was involved in a cable that went across the Atlantic, but Cyrus Field laid the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable. In 1896, Guglielmo Marconi invented a wireless telegraph. He used electromagnetic waves instead of cables. And that was amazing that they could now, telegraph things without wires. And this would eventually lead to something else. It would lead to the radio, which was one of the most important modes of long distance communication ever. And these would be transmitted by electromagnetic waves instead of cables. There is Marconi, and down at the bottom we have Morse. And who is this? Yes, we do. We have Alexander Graham Bell, the Bell telephone. So this revolutionized communications. Alexander Graham Bell lived 1847 to 1922. He was a Scottish American, and he had a lifelong interest in the problems of the deaf. And he studied sound transmissions. So he was studying sound all the time. Then in 1876, he patented his first telephone. And he actually got onto this by a mistake during his inventions, where he had spilled coffee on himself, and he said, come, come. And so he was calling for his colleague to come, and it went through the telephone wire. This was demonstrated then at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia that same year in 1876. Lord Kelvin, who was a great scientist at the time, called it the most wonderful thing in America was the new telephone. And at the turn of the century in 1800, millions of telephones were in service. Then came science and the age of industry. And we'll start with chemistry and on to physics, because a lot of inventions happened by scientists, right? In 1803, John Dalton, he lived 1766 to 1844, he proposed the atomic theory that all matter is composed of submolecular particles called atoms. So John Dalton is known for that. And then came Michael Faraday, 1791 to 1867 is when he lived, and he discovered the relationship between electricity and magnetism, which led to the invention of the electric motor and the electric generator. So here we have two great scientists. On to physics. Of course, we have Lord Kelvin, which we talked about before. He was really intrigued by the telephone, as you know. Well, he lived in 1824 to 1907. And he formulated the laws of thermodynamics, which is very important, especially the second law of thermodynamics that talks about entropy. And also, he went into what was absolute zero for temperature. What a great scientist. In England, Lord. Whenever you say Lord, you know they're English, right? So on to James Clerk Maxwell, 1831 to 1879. And he laid the foundation for electric engineering by mathematically explaining electrical force and electromagnetic energy as waves. So he said, before we thought, of course, Isaac Newton, he thought they were particles. And now Maxwell says, no, they act as waves, like sound waves, like waves in the ocean. But now we find basically, if we look at the electricity, it's both particle and both waves. But he didn't know that back then. So Pierre and Marie Curie, who were they? Well, they experimented with something new, radioactivity, and they discovered polonium and radium, and these were radioactive elements. And they were the first in doing experiments with radioactive material. Health and medicine. In 1796, Edward Jenner, who lived in England, developed a first vaccine for smallpox, for the smallpox vaccine, for a smallpox immunity. Well, this was taken by Louis Pasteur. When we think of medicine, he is like one of the foundational medical scientists of the world at that time. Well, Louis Pasteur observed bacteria, which led to the development of the germ theory of disease. That disease are caused by germs, or these small little microorganisms, right? Pasteur developed the methods of preventing infection, including vaccines for lethal diseases such as anthrax, cholera, and rabies. Pasteurization, is called, killed the microorganisms that caused milk and wine and other foods to spoil. So now they could drink milk without getting bacterial diseases, right? So in 1867, Joseph Lister, he was actually one of Pasteur's followers or students, and looked at Pasteur's work and introduced the use of antiseptics to fight germs following surgeries. And this greatly reduced deaths that were caused by infections of wounds and incisions in surgery. These are big things. Of course, then our lifespan back then, mankind's lifespan, would increase. Before the 19th century, lifespan was relatively short because a lot of babies died. John Wesley's parents had 19 children, but only 9 survived in infancy. So a lot of babies died back then. In 1755, the lifespan in Sweden was only 33, and by 1840 it had increased to 40. In the United States, between 1789 and 1840, lifespan was 35 to 41. It increased from 35 to 41. And the famines and the plague threats were less. Of course, smallpox, that was a disease that killed so many people, especially indigenous people in the Americas. Whole tribes of people were killed by smallpox. But now we had a vaccine for smallpox. And this increased the living standards. And of course, then there were advances in better nourishment, and health care. And more children lived to maturity. And people were just living longer. The last one I'm going to talk about is Thomas Edison. And he was the world's greatest inventor, probably that ever was. He lived in 1847 to 1931. He lived in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and there he established his first modern scientific laboratory, and they called him the Wizard of Menlo Park because he was constantly inventing things. He never even claimed to be a great scientist at all, but he was a technological genius. In technology, he was a genius. His great skill was putting scientific principles into practical use. In fact, do you know how many inventions he did? Do you know how many inventions he patented? 1,093 inventions. And some of these included things that we have used today and we know about today. The phonograph, the microphone, the motion picture projector, the mimeograph, the telephone. Well, he didn't invent the telephone, but he advanced the telephone, and the telegraph were advanced by his inventions. But he had one really great invention that we're going to talk about, the light bulb. He was decided to invent the light bulb because one of his colleagues, I should say, one of the guys that worked for him, Lewis Howard Latimer, improved this bulb that Edison had put this filament for a light filament in, this carbon filament, And Latimer invented this carbon filament and patented it in 1881. And Latimer was a member of Edison's research team, which was called Edison's Pioneers. In 1882, Latimer developed and patented a method of manufacturing these carbon filaments. So, well, like we said, Thomas Edison never said he was a great scientist, but he had scientists working for him, didn't he? Well, he put together and as using and putting together that we could use this filament for light. Wow. So of all of his inventions, the one which has had the most profound effect on modern society is the incandescent electric light bulb. So Thomas Edison will forever be known for the light bulb. Although we should remember Latimer, and he was an African American. We should remember that he too had part in this invention. So that's it for today.